What's going on, guys? Isaiah's here. So let me just get behind the table because I want to talk about the hot topic of the day. It's already been beat to death, but wanted to give my take on him. And I just want to say up front, I don't mean any disrespect by this video. I know there have been some comments made by some veterans of the sport in terms of opinions surrounding the Kings move. And I'm a newer generation puller, even though I'm like 30 years old. I've been pulling for about a year and a half. I have a background in personal training. I have a decent understanding of the human body. And I just see things that I have questions and concerns that people say. And I just want to give my take on what's being said. I'm not going to name names. I feel the names aren't as important as the concepts and ideas that are being talked about here. So I'm just going to go ahead and just start addressing things in no particular order. But well, let's just get into it here. This might be a long video, by the way. So the first thing I wanted to address, when people talk about the Kings move, very controversial move. People will say that it's not in the spirit of arm wrestling. And in regards to what constitutes the spirit of arm wrestling or the spirit of any particular endeavor or hobby that you're involved in, really that's going to be a subjective thing. You may have grown up doing it, but as with anything else, you have to allow for nuance and evolution in whatever particular thing you're doing. Things change over time, and you may not like the change, but that's ultimately the way things will gravitate. And so, you could have your own opinions and convictions, but have the conversation open to, a nuanced discussion. So we can actually hash out the details concerning what should be included and what shouldn't be and for what reasons, right? We shouldn't be trying to gatekeep. We should be trying to forward the conversation. So it's always been a bit bothersome to me whenever I get into something and I'm a bit newer at it, and we have people who just try to hard line have an opinion about something that if you don't agree with them, then all of a sudden you're going to be shunned from whatever that particular social group is, right? I've never been a fan of that thing. So that being said, let's talk about the technicalities of the Kings move, the injury risk, and certain lines of logic that people have brought up here and there concerning this move. So first off, I guess let's just talk about injury risk. In terms of injury risk, biomechanically speaking, some people I think may be more predisposed to injury risk doing a Kings move than others. Me personally speaking, I feel quite comfortable in the position. I've seen people, to be quite honest with you, I've been watching arm wrestling for quite a few years now. I think I can count on one hand the amount of things I've seen happen as a result of injuries concerning a Kings move, and I've seen a bunch of other injuries from other techniques that are just standard techniques, top rolls, hooks, and that sort of thing. People, breaking arms, going frame on frame in a hook. People, breaking arms and popping biceps in a hook and a top roll and that sort of thing. I don't believe necessarily that being in a Kings move is going to predispose you any particular way more for injury than another technique. In terms of what I believe really constitutes more injuries than anything else, there's your natural arm break position, right? At a twisting motion with the humerus there. That's number one. The other thing that I think more people don't talk about is just, overuse and other recovery injuries there. I think that's the number one reason why a lot of injuries happen in arm wrestling is people not understanding the recovery periods for your tendons. People have a pretty decent understanding of muscle recovery, but when it comes to your tendons, a lot of people neglect the fact that oftentimes after strenuous activity, it can be up to 2 weeks before your tendons really recover from a pulling session. That's why we have guys like Chris Drummond on YouTube talking about only pulling once a month for the sake of recovery, which I can definitely understand and respect. But in terms of the social aspect and running a group, it's easier said than done. So, but a lot of guys train like complete, I'm just gonna say the word idiots, right? They don't taper well, they don't taper properly, they don't take care of themselves, they don't stretch, they don't massage, they don't, try to keep the inflammation down in their joints. They eat like trash. They get crappy sleep. There's a number of things that come into it. and then all of a sudden, you're never really fully recovered and something just goes. I think that's going to be number one above anything else besides like an obvious arm break position, right? So that's injury risk. And again, I feel quite comfortable being in an open top rope position like that. So besides that, I wanted to talk about certain lines of logic here. In terms of, I saw somebody say that if you have a straight arm, that should constitute a pin, right? I don't agree with that whatsoever. In terms of what constitutes a pin in arm wrestling, it's never been contingent on the angle of your humerus relative to your forearm. It's always been like whether or not your wrists, or I guess like even slightly below your wrists in certain organizations, but your wrist and above, if it crosses the pin pad line or touches the pad, that's been what constitutes a pin. It's not the angle of your humerus. Like, that could be a pretty slippery slope discussion there, because I mean, like, how many different angles can you be in your humerus, right? It's always been like wrist or slightly below, and then forward at this line or below it. There's parallel pins as well. So this line of reasoning that just because your humerus is straight in relation to your forearm just doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't understand why people say that there. And yeah, I mean, I will say, in terms of one thing that I do grant for people who don't like the King's move, who don't agree with it, is that if your shoulder is like dipping below the table, I believe that should still constitute a foul. Because at that point in time, like if you're relying on more of a skeletal structural lock in your elbow to hold up in place of using a lot of musculature and more tendon strength than anything else, I believe at that point that starts to deviate from the nature of the sport, right? So at that, like, in my opinion, right? So with that being said, like, you can still be isometrically, like with your arm pretty much straight, applying a lot of pronating back pressure. Like you might be in this position, and this is what it'll look like, right? But in reality, the motion that's occurring there is something like this. Like if you were to let go, it'd be like this, right? That's the motion that's actually occurring. And somebody said that you're not getting stronger when you're doing a King's move. And that right there, I apologize, but that just is not true whatsoever. It's already been a proven fact that isometric holds do in fact increase strength. So when somebody says that you're not getting stronger just because you're in that position, that is absolutely not true. I am very sorry, but isometric holds 100% can increase strength, do increase strength. So that is just not factually correct there. So, but yeah, in terms of, at a certain point, and I do try to be cognizant of this, but sometimes it's kind of hard to tell when you're in that position, like if your forearm, unless you're like really looking directly at it, right? Sometimes you might dip a little bit below, but you might feel like you're actually parallel until you like look back at some footage, you're like, oh shit. So it might be better to like exaggerate it a little bit. And that tends to occur because you're posting so hard on your elbow, and you're trying to, do this up pressure, this rising pressure with the pronation, that, you tend to sit back a little bit there. So, I mean, that's ultimately why that ends up occurring. But of course, there's foul rules in place for that. And, if you foul too much, then you'll give the opponent your win, right? So, yeah, that's basically that. The other line of thinking is, I've heard people say stand up and arm wrestle. That right there just doesn't make sense to me from like a couple different perspectives. First off, in our sport, we have something called sit down arm wrestling. That's just kind of funny to me, ironic. But the other side of things is, like, when you're actually going for a finishing position, you're basically, like, if you're pronating, you're squatting down, right? If you're trying to pronate out, like can opener your opponent, and that sort of thing, like you're squatting down. So, you're squatting down in like multiple different instances when you're doing stand-up arm wrestling. So why don't we particularly discriminate against the King's move just because you're in a squatted down position in a defensive technique instead of an offensive technique. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry. So the other side of things that I also saw somebody say, somebody posted, hey, is a flop wrist press okay? And people were like up and down, like, yeah, flop wrist press is definitely okay. You're above the table, you're still here, right? You got the rest of everything. And I find that super interesting and just not reasonable, because when you're thinking about the two extremes of the spectrums here, you have a flop wrist press in which you've lost your wrist flexion. You've lost a part of the chain here, right? And you're trying to finish, right, without having your wrist flexion. The opposite side, when you have a King's move, you essentially lost another part of the chain, which is your elbow flexion, although you're like isometrically pressuring against it, right? You've lost that, and you've essentially kept your hand. And your hand is the majority of what's keeping you in the fight. So why is it that we say it's okay to adapt the technique in which you lose one end of the chain, and that's perfectly fine, but we shouldn't adapt the technique for the other end of the chain in which you lose your elbow flexion instead of your wrist flexion? That just honestly doesn't make any sense to me. The other side of things, I guess coming back to when we're talking about the spirit of arm wrestling, one thing that I think more people need to put some respect on is the fact that when you're in a King's move and you're fighting against it or trying to use it, that is one of the most technical battles that our sport has seen. And like in most other techniques, it's fairly straightforward, right? Like you're just trying to finish in a certain position, right? But when you're going against the Kings, we have seen it happen time and time again, where it becomes a battle of endurance for a lot of people, and it becomes a psychological thing in terms of knowing when to go for what, right? I only grew in my respect for this technique when I had a guy come onto my team by the name of Antonio. I outweigh Antonio by over 100 pounds. Antonio weighs about 150 pounds. And this guy, he really shined the light on the proficiency of a proper King's move. And he had me, and I'm a pretty decently strong guy. I'm not gonna like toot my own horn, you know, but like I would say I'm decently strong at this point, right? And going against Antonio, I was here, had my wrist flexion, had everything, right? And I was trying to finish, and I couldn't finish. And you know, I got everything burning up, wrist, elbow, bicep, everything's burning up. I'm trying to press, and he pronates every time I try to press, and when I'll come back, he would climb into my hand with supination. Then when I'll go again, and he kept getting higher and higher and higher. Then next thing I know, I was getting burnt out. And I was like, wow, dude, like I had to really focus on the battle of attrition and how I wanted to approach it, right? So I saw somebody say that the King's move is easy to beat. It can be, but it can also cause a lot of problems for you depending on how you are as a puller, right? Because me personally, having practiced this move now against several people, several exceptionally strong people who have managed to get stops on using this, I can tell you right now, a lot of people end up burning out with this technique. People who have been pulling for years when they pull against it. And this goes into another thing which somebody said, which I deeply disagree with, which is that you shouldn't use this in a practice. Like they said, they're lying, essentially verbatim what they said is you shouldn't use it in a practice, but in a competition, you do what you have to do. And that to me just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I apologize. But basically, you're setting yourself up for a very bad day if you're telling people not to practice or use a technique that's allowed in the confines of your organization. That to me just does not add up. I'm very sorry. So like, that being said, like if I were to go, now that I've practiced against the Kings with a proficient Kings mover, right? And I actually got some tips on how I can improve my Kings as well, right? From that point, if I were to run into a Kings in a competition, I'll feel vastly more confident in terms of my ability to combat that technique, to understand the battle of attrition that occurs there, and how to actually win that. But if you're somebody, all you're used to is getting into these fights where they pin or you pin, and it's like over like half a second, and you haven't ever experienced what it's like to get stopped by that incredibly strong pronating back crusher at the edge of the pad, you are going to set yourself up for a very bad day when you come up against somebody who's proficient in this technique. So you should definitely, I feel, practice against it in practice and use it in practice so you can actually understand how extreme this battle can actually feel. Trust me, you go in one of these minute and a half long pulling sessions against a proper Kings mover, bro, you are going to come out of that feeling burned like nothing else. I'm telling you. So that right there, I just don't see why that makes any sense to not use it in a practice. I feel like, personally speaking, you should be ready for anything in a competition. As inexperienced as I am, but as experienced in life as I've already come to understand, I can say that, right? Be ready for pretty much anything. Have the knowledge of it and how to counter it, and you will be in a much better position, right? Like ultimately, being strong is going to be one of the most important things. But let's say, theoretically speaking, you have the peak strength to be able to flash somebody 3 times, right? And if they were to just try to go center off center with you, you would win that battle every time, right? But they managed to pull the Kings off, and they managed to get you in this position, and they managed to really put some fatigue into your arm. Your amount of peak strength that you're going to have for the consecutive rounds is going to go down substantially. And then from that point on, what you had in the beginning, they took it away from you, and now you're fighting a losing battle with somebody who may not have had enough, as much peak strength as you, but they had enough defensive strength in that technique to be able to stop you enough to drain your peak strength, right? That's an example of something I'm trying to get at as far as being ready for a competition pull. So this right here, I think I've addressed most everything that I wanted to here. So basically all this to say that I think we need to put more respect on this technique. We've already seen at the elite level how effective this technique can be. And so I think discounting it just doesn't really make any sense. And again, I'm open to discussions about this, right? And that's not to say that when I'm practicing, like here's an example of like how I'll conduct the practice with the Kings move, right? Now, in my previous practice video, which I uploaded, I went against a ranked bull who was exceptionally strong. So I basically had to more or less divert to the Kings off the initial pull. Usually though, if I'm going against somebody like the rest of my group who I tend to outmatch, right? Most of the time, I'm not starting in a Kings. What'll happen is we're going off center and we're doing our thing off center as much as we can. Then as the practice goes longer, say an hour and a half comes along, and people start catching up to me, they start fatiguing my arm, my elbow flexion. At that point in time, I'll start to practice more of a Kings move, right? And that's when I'll delve into that technique and into those deep waters with my teammates to explore how we can improve that technique, right? And that's when I'll also typically practice a technique like the front wrist press, because my wrist flexion at that point is more fatigued. But when you have all the energy, obviously practicing off center is going to be the number one, right? So these are just my takes. I'm open to conversations. Again, no disrespect to anybody here, but like I just see things, I observe things. I've come to learn, I think, a decent amount for the sport at this point in time. Some things just don't add up in my head. But again, I say this is a video, just to spark some conversation. And hopefully we can have a productive discussion. So that's pretty much it for today, guys. And before I go, I just want to say that Michael Todd is the greatest arm wrestler on the planet. Thank you.